I'm Andrew Holecek, and I'm delighted to be able to spend the next few minutes talking to you about what I see as the now and future of Buddhism. I think it's really helpful at the outset to set some kind of historical context or perspective. And by this, what I mean is that even though Buddhism came to America in the 1840s with the immigration of Chinese immigrants to the West Coast, it really didn't take root until the 1950s and 60s, when charismatic teachers like Maizumi Roshi, Suzuki Roshi, and Trungpa Rinpoche found their way to the West. So on one level, Buddhism in America really, it's 50 to 60 years old, which is just a drop in the bucket when you look at the 2,600-year history of Buddhism. So on one hand, you could say that maybe we don't need to fix something that isn't broken. Maybe we need to give Buddhism a little bit more time to take root and adapt to the West. But yet there are a number of really sensitive scholars and teachers who are looking at the transplantation of Buddhism in the West, and they're starting to see some issues. They're starting to see areas where course correction or modification may be in order. One thing is absolutely certain, and that is as Buddhism finds its home in America, it will be different from the Buddhism in other countries. I've had the great good fortune over the last 20 years of traveling somewhat extensively in Asia, and I can assure you that the Buddhism in Thailand is really different from the Buddhism in Tibet. And the Buddhism in Cambodia is really pretty different from that in Mongolia or Vietnam. I often imagine Buddhism as a kind of flowing stream of wisdom, like water, flowing from one culture into the next. And as it does so, its genius is its adaptability, its ability to flow into the existing cultural containers from one country to the next. It remains to be seen what those cultural containers will be in the West, but I think one could make a good case that they will be, in fact, the containers of science and psychology. I used to tell people years ago when I first became involved in Buddhism, and they asked me what I was doing, I would often say, well, I'm a Tibetan Buddhist. And then I realized that's not quite accurate, because I'm really not. I'm an American Buddhist studying a form of Buddhism as it migrated into Tibet. So the type of Buddhism that I'm working with is already 2 countries away, 2 cultural forms away from the primary origin, the land of origin, India. So I want to talk to you now a little bit about the promise of Buddhism. What's really working? And really, for me, this is a very exciting time for Buddhism in the West. You could say that business is really good. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of centers popping up in America. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of legitimate teachers, those who've had the proper training in the West, or those who have migrated from the East. And depending on which numbers you refer to, there's upwards of 4 million serious practitioners of Buddhism in America today. And I find it also very interesting when I look at the larger scheme of things. There's this kind of co-emergent quality to the acceptance of Buddhism in the West. And by this, what I mean is that according to a number of traditions, we're living in a dark age. Hinduism, of course, refers to this as the Kali Yuga. Buddhism sometimes talks about it as the age of degenerate dharma, which in Japanese is referred to as Mappo. And while there are many obvious overt manifestations of this darkness in things like global warming, ecological devastation, political and economic crises, I think a more insidious signature of the Dark Age is this rampant epidemic and addiction to distraction. And I think we could make a pretty reasonable argument that the overt manifestations are really grand expressions of this covert manifestation. This is the real signature of darkness, distraction. And with all these weapons of mass distraction, so available in the West, without some level of antidote, it's only going to get darker. So to me, what's so provocative, the co-emergent quality, is that with the arising of this darkness comes the light of meditation, the light of mindfulness, the antidote that can really bring about a sense of remedy to what otherwise would be a pretty damaging situation. When I first began my studies and exploration of this tradition some 30 years ago, you would be hard-pressed to find 10 books on this topic, truly, at least in the public domain. And I think it's pretty reasonable to say that there are almost 10 books a month coming out on this topic. And I think part of the fascination with Buddhism has to do with the deep association and the near conflation, the near synonymous nature of Buddhism with mindfulness. It's almost as if Buddhism is sliding in on the coattails of the proven benefits of mindfulness meditation. And with something like 400 studies a year now coming out, rigorous clinical studies, that's more than one study a day. With all these studies proving the benefits of meditation, Buddhism is sneaking in the back door along with these proven benefits. And this is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in the sense that once science gets its mitts on something and proves it, particularly because in the West we turn to science. Our scientists are really the high priests of our culture. They are the ones we turn to for answers about reality. So as science proves it, meditation, and then really by conflation, Buddhism is really finding a foothold in the West. This is a fantastic blessing. But the shadow side, the near enemy, the curse behind this is that Buddhism is so much more than mindfulness. As Ken is so fond of saying, it transcends but includes mindfulness. Mindfulness fundamentally, as powerful and as important as it is, mindfulness is fundamentally neutral. I mean, you can be mindful when you're pulling the trigger to kill somebody, or you can be mindful when you're performing an operation. So we need to be aware of this great gift of science and its validation, you could say, of meditation, and by implication, Buddhism. But we also have to be very sensitive to the trap of scientism and how it is that science can inappropriately colonize Buddhism. And this is a real and present danger. The other area of tremendous promise that I see in the West is the increased dialogue and the conversation and the trust that's taking place between Buddhism and psychology. This is a really rich arena of cross-pollination. It's as if psychology and spirituality together are connecting the developmental and spiritual dots and creating a kind of, I suppose you could say, a psycho-spiritual matrix of human evolution and development that isn't completely pregnant with possibilities, because it provides a container, a vocabulary, a form that those of us in the West can really connect to and that we can really take refuge in. So while there's so much more to say about the brilliance of Buddhism and its rising sun in the West, wherever you find light, you will find shadows. And I think it's more fruitful to spend time talking about the perils of this transplantation. And I think partly because by understanding some of these potential pitfalls, we can start to see how something like integral theory can really come forth as a way to help us deal with some of these challenges. So one of the areas of challenge I see in the West, and I want to put forth a number of these for you, is the challenge of proper marketing. It's very easy to oversell the product of Buddhism and therefore somewhat ironically shortchange it. In my experience, expectation is often premeditated disappointment. So if we overpromise this tradition, we will fundamentally not give it a chance to speak in its own vocabulary. I think we always need to remember that Buddhism fundamentally is a journey without goal. It's a journey without distance. So if we don't market the goals, quote unquote, intelligently and sensitively, we can lose our integrity. We could even say one of the best things we can do is introduce some kind of bullshit meter in the West. What is an appropriate marketing scheme? And then who is holding that bullshit meter? There has to be some reference to tradition and lineage, which I'll refer to later. So marketing is really a big problem, especially with all these proven benefits coming out. It's almost inconceivable when you really study the literature that meditation, and then again by association, that meditation can do so much. It's almost unbelievable. So we have to be careful in terms of how we present this tradition into the West without overselling it. Closely associated with this is the lust that we have in the Western world for rapid results. We want the quick fix. We want the silver bullet. And because of that, there's this unfortunate propensity to skim. And I was at a retreat a couple weeks ago where this very humorous lady from New York, as she was walking by me, I overheard her say to herself, "Come on, inner peace, I ain't got all day." Well, you know, it may take all day, and it may take many days, it may take an entire lifetime. I often envision the current state of spirituality in the West, and individual and collective. It's as if the Titanic of confusion, the Titanic of mindlessness, has been on full throttle charging across the Atlantic. You're not going to turn the Titanic around on a dime. The momentum has to be exhausted. The mind has to turn in its own way. We can't force these results. So impatience is a real problem in the West. We need to realize that it's taken us quite a bit of time to get so confused, so asleep, so mindless. It may take some time to wake up, to achieve some wisdom, and to achieve the stability of mindfulness. Very associated with this, if you're keeping track, this would be number 3 in my list, is this lust for and near addiction to spiritual experiences. In integral speak, this would be referred to as state junkies. Those of us who are addicted to different states of consciousness. We always need to remember, and this is somewhat startling for people to really understand, I believe, the Buddhism fundamentally isn't about making you feel good. It's about making you feel real. Reality is much more important than our version of spirituality. In fact, if I was to hang my hat on one definition of what Buddhism actually is, it's a world religion, of course, I think principally for tax purposes. It's a philosophy, it's a science of mind. But for me, Buddhism is a description of reality. So we need to be aware that there is a place for spiritual highs. There is a place for state experiences in Buddhism. But it's exactly the same space and place that's reserved for spiritual lows. So we need to remember the fundamental instruction that we must relate to the good, the bad, and the ugly with equanimity. Otherwise we've simply replaced a chain made of lead with one made of gold. And there are a lot of people in the West who get stuck in this because these spiritual experiences, these state experiences, they're very sexy. They market and they sell. And you can spend an entire lifetime stuck in a state experience at the peril of developing the structural framework that allows you to nurture and transcend that state experience. I mean, my teacher Khenpo Rinpoche once said that you nurture your meditative experience by destroying it. You don't destroy the experience itself, you destroy your inappropriate attachment to that experience. And this is a real issue in the West because we do want to feel good. We love the kind of high, the meditator's high that takes place with long-term meditation and breakthrough into these different states and these higher states of consciousness. So we have to be very aware of this insidious trap that you can spend years, you can waste years or an entire lifetime stuck in these state experiences. The other issue closely associated, my number 4, is the issue of breadth versus depth. As Buddhism spreads across the Western landscape, and it spreads so quickly, there's the real and present danger that it may spread too thin. To me, it's very similar. I think we can learn some powerful lessons from the growth and the development of yoga in the West, because 20 or 30 years ago, yoga was a fairly unknown commodity. And yet within a generation, you'll now find it in strip malls, you'll find it in health clubs, you'll find it everywhere, and this is fantastic. the breadth and the expanse of yoga in the Western world is terribly exciting. This is both a good and a bad thing, however, though. I mean, I wonder, what would Pattabhi Joy say? What would Patanjali say? What would Krishnamacharya say? Because as yoga has found its way in the West, it has adapted and maybe questionably into forms like, again, there are dozens, if not hundreds. We have things like hot yoga, power yoga, yin yoga. And while these may be wonderful ways for the Western world to connect to the yogic tradition, we need to always be aware, are we forsaking integrity for the sake of income? Are we really selling tradition for the sake of convenience? So in a very real, analogous fashion, and I think you get the point here, we have to be aware of the tendency to create things like hot Buddhism, core power Buddhism, yin Buddhism. I mean, we already have things in the West like secular Buddhism and Shambhala Buddhism. And please understand, I am not dissing these. I am actually a student of Shambhala Buddhism. But it might be helpful for us to say, what would the Buddha say? Are we really staying on track as this tradition adapts to the Western world? I think also very closely associated here is the real danger of meditation instructors. How well trained are these individuals? Do they have lineage backing? Are they involved in the tradition? Are they certified, so to speak? Have they had the training? Because without it, things can become very slippery and very dangerous. When you're dealing with spiritual, psychological intimacy, it's very easy to cross the threshold into physical intimacy. And you only have to look at all the scandals in the West to see how ubiquitous this particular problem is. And then associated with this then, of course, is how much integrity do we have with our own meditation? How strong and true to the tradition is our own meditation? Kando Rinpoche is one of my favorite female tulkus or awakened ones teaching in the West. And she's very unequivocal and assertive when she says, you know, if you're engaged in this path and you are not finding yourself more kind, more compassionate, you're doing something wrong. You are practicing your version of meditation, your version of Buddhism. So this is a wonderful yardstick. And we need to have meditation instructors that we can take refuge in, teachers we can take refuge in, that can provide the sounding board for us to make this accurate assessment, because self-deception is rampant, it's epidemic. It's so easy to kid ourselves and to fool ourselves. So Vince Lombardi once said a wonderful thing. He said, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. What is it when we sit on the meditation cushion? What is it that we're actually practicing? So we need qualified guidance. We need qualified teachers and instructors to really help us. Connected to this, if you're keeping track, my number 5 would be the real danger of diluting the teachings for Western consumption. Filtering and editing, it's like a salad bar kind of spirituality where we simply pick and choose what suits our tastes, and often perhaps leaving out those bitter components of the path that fundamentally may be the most transformative. We need to remember that when the Buddha taught, the very first thing he taught were the 4 noble truths. And one of the reasons they're called noble is because it takes a noble disposition, it takes a noble character for someone to realize the uncompromising nature of the reality that these truths describe. And we always need to remember, at least based on my experience, both as a practitioner and as a meditation instructor for well over 20 years, as an MI, that waking up is not always pleasant. Waking up hurts. It really can be seen as a kind of detoxification. So when it starts to hurt, do we jettison those aspects that are causing us discomfort, or do we, under the proper guidance, continue to pay allegiance to the methodologies of the tradition as it's been handed down for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and surrender to those methods and allow the transformative magic to really take root in our own being? So really, I think a fundamental issue for teachers and writers and scholars in the West is we need to be responsible stewards for this extraordinary tradition. And we always need to remember that it's very easy to lose the essence in the display. It's very easy to lose the heart essence of this teaching, this vast noble tradition, in the display of the tradition. I find this very interesting because it's the same problem we face on an individual basis. You could say that the reason we suffer as individuals is that we lose the essence of the mind in the display of the mind. We get caught up in the forms. We get lost in the forms. We get excessively involved in those forms. And in exactly the same way, it's so easy in the West to get lost in the display of Buddhism as it struggles to find its shine in the Western world. So this is something we need to be aware of, maintaining allegiance to the integrity of this tradition. So another issue that I see is really one that Trungpa Rinpoche talked about over 30 years ago. And this, of course, is the challenge and the danger of spiritual materialism. It's just as much alive, if not more so, than it was 30-some years ago. So spiritual materialism is when we take a body of teachings or practices that are designed to transcend the ego and subvert them into reifying the ego, to actually substantiating the ego. And once again, in my experience personally and as an MI, it's really not a question of if you're going to be infected with spiritual materialism, but rather when. So once again, by simply bringing this unconscious propensity into conscious awareness and recognizing the real talent we have for appropriating anything to kind of substantiate our sense of self, we can be better aware of this potentiality and therefore avoid it. And the seventh issue I have is the real danger of psychologizing Buddhism. I talked earlier about the great gift of the cross-pollination between Buddhism and psychology. But this issue of conflation becomes really problematic because it's very tempting in the West, because of the power of the psychological tradition, to skim off the psychological truths from Buddhism and turn it into a kind of therapy, a self-improvement project, a self-help project. So we need to remember that this particular tradition is not about self-fulfillment, it's about self-transcendence. And even though Buddhism is therapeutic, even though it has healing properties, healing and transformative therapeutic qualities, it is not therapy. It is therapeutic, but it is not therapy. And in a very real sense, especially if you're talking to traditional proponents of Buddhism in the West, Buddhism doesn't need therapy in both senses of that phrase. So we have to be very careful to respect the object domains of these noble traditions, allowing them to cross-pollinate without cross-polluting. And this is a real challenge in the West. And number 8, if you're keeping track, this is an issue I think that's been circumambulating everything I've said so far. And this is really the challenge of proper translation. What is it that's lost in translation? And what can we find in translation? And here I'm talking about several different levels of translation. The first, of course, is liturgical, or the literal translation of the word. And this is why it's very helpful to have multiple translations, to have different people referring to the same text, because people will be translating these from different developmental and state levels of development. How realized are these translators? How well can they read into the nuances of the text? How much integrity can they bring to the translation? I think just as importantly, and perhaps even more so, are the cultural translators. How can we make this noble tradition speak to us? How can we make it relevant to our lives? What is the vocabulary, the metaphor, the cultural transmission that will allow us to resonate with this truth? So I think cultural translation is just as important, if not more so, than literal liturgical translation. But it's the union of proper translation altogether. What can we find in translation that is something that all translators, I believe, need to be aware of? How do we color these teachings with our own structural level of development? So another issue I see in the West is the issue of inflexibility, the kind of blind allegiance to perhaps stale and expired forms. So we need to take refuge and pay homage to the power of lineage and tradition in Buddhism, because it's about as close as you can get to a guarantee of legitimacy and authenticity. But if we take excessive refuge in the tradition, it becomes too rigid. We can ossify it. We can make it too solid. So Buddhism needs to evolve and adapt, but without selling out to the forms in which this adaptation can be taken. So we need to pay homage to the tradition. We need to pay deep respect to lineage, but without allowing lineage and tradition to fossilize the teachings. And number 10, what I see here as a real issue is, how are we in the West going to work with the challenge of surrender? And by this I mean two levels of surrender. On one hand, Buddhism is unbelievably simple. The Buddha himself repeatedly said, "I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering." And I think you could make a really strong case that the entire spiritual path, certainly as I've come to understand it, can really be summarized and encapsulated in one very profound and compelling word. And that's relaxation. Relax into the nature of your being. Relax into the nature of your mind, and you will discover the divinity within you. You will discover the Buddha within you. You will discover the ultimate guru, your Buddha nature, already within you. And yet this teaching is so simple, it's hard to believe. It's so easy, it's hard to trust. So because of our love affair in the West with speed and complexity, we tend to complexify this. We tend to make it more complex. It's really a compliment to talk about somebody being quick. It's not much of a compliment to say that somebody is slow and simple. But complexity doesn't stand a chance against simplicity once we surrender to it. Simplicity has the power to cut through complexity and take us to the truth, if in fact we're willing to surrender to that simplicity and that truth. How willing are we in the West to engage in this level of healthy surrender? And of course, even more challenging is the real issue of surrendering to a teacher, surrendering to a guru. In the West, because we don't want anybody to tell us what to do, it's very easy to step aside from this particular invitation or the challenge of surrender. And by so doing, we really miss out on the highest levels of spiritual transformation. Because as it said in the Vajrayana teachings, which is really the teachings I take principal refuge in, surrender to the teacher, devotion to the teacher, and Bhakti Yoga in Hinduism, of course, reiterates this. Devotion to the teacher is the single most transformative aspect of the path. It is said that devotion alone can take you to full awakening. It is devotion that matures into realization. But of course, the devotion here has to be to an authentic teacher. We have to make the very powerful and important distinction between guru principle, kind of an informed or intelligent surrender, versus guruism, which gives birth to something like Jonestown. This is an idiot form of surrender. And my friend Elizabeth Namgyal, she speaks so beautifully about what she talks about is the F word in Buddhism. And the F word, of course, is faith. Do we have the courage to have faith in this tradition as it is presented to us? This isn't the idiot faith that people like Sam Harris talk about so beautifully. This is an intelligent faith that allows us to surrender to a higher being, a higher manifestation of being, as it's represented in an external entity, always remembering that those external manifestations are mere reflections or mirrors of the ultimate guru, the ultimate surrender, which is surrendering to the divinity within us. But you see, we don't trust that, we don't believe it. So this issue of proper surrender in the West is a real one. And I believe at the highest stages of the path, if we are unable or unwilling, incapable of this level of genuine surrender and devotion, then perhaps the single most important transformative component of this path is lost. So the next issue I see, and this is really a big one for me, is the issue of spiritual bypassing. This is the term that was coined by my friend John Wellwood. And this has to do with an abuse of the central teaching of Buddhism, at least as I understand it. Really, the strength of this Buddhist tradition, its great gift to humanity, is its teachings on emptiness, its teachings on absolute truth. And while it's well beyond the scope of unfolding the central doctrine of emptiness, it's important to realize that it's very easy to take excessive refuge in emptiness at the expense of honoring form and the evolution of that form. We forget, it's so easy to forget as practitioners, the central teaching of the Heart Sutra, that form is emptiness, emptiness is form, emptiness is no other than form is no other than emptiness. So what spiritual bypassing does is spiritual bypassing uses absolute truth to disparage relative truth and to negate, therefore, things like the immutable laws of causality, the immutable laws of karma. It's very easy and facile to say, as so many Western so-called teachers do, just do it. Just do it. Well, on an absolute level, it's true. You just need to relax into the nature of your mind. But if we don't acknowledge the formidable power of relative truth, if we don't acknowledge the strength of karma, then we can say just do it as much as you want, and we fundamentally will not transform. Spiritual bypassing also uses unity or oneness to belittle individuality. It uses emptiness to devalue form. And it therefore engenders overt and covert levels of escapism. This tendency we all have to avoid the gritty work of human development and to shirk our responsibilities of being embedded beings on this planet. This tendency to use spirituality as an escape is a real one. Almaas once said that really when you set out on the spiritual path, you're unwittingly setting out for heaven. And we tend to forget that the fundamental trajectory of this path is to bring our heavenly realization back into earth, to see that the kingdom of heaven is spread out across the earth, as the Gnostic tradition says, and men simply do not see it. So the unity of absolute and relative truth is the fruition of this path, not excessive pathological refuge in the absolute. And there is such a tendency in the West to do that. Just get me out of here. Let me check out. Let me run away. If you don't fulfill your liberation by coming back into the forms in which you are embedded, your liberation will be partial. Spiritual bypassing itself is a manifestation of the last thing I want to talk about. And this is what some sociologists refer to as single action bias. Single action bias. And this can be very easily paraphrased as putting all your eggs in one basket. In simple kind of colloquial terms, if you're interested in working with ecological situations, you may, for instance, think that recycling is really your contribution. It's all you need to do. Well, of course it's not. We need to raise our gaze. We need to learn about things, for instance, like industrial ecology and how it is that our purchases contribute to ecological conservation or devastation. But in terms of spirituality, it's very interesting to me how many people, how many Buddhists do you know that can name all 8 aspects of the Eightfold Noble Path? Most people take excessive refuge in either right meditation or right mindfulness. They can't even name the other 6. And the Eightfold Noble Path itself can be summarized in a more condensed teaching called the 3 trainings, or the Triciksha, which is in Sanskrit Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna, or ethics, meditation, and insight. And what this refers to is that insight into the nature of mind and reality, which is really what liberation is contingent upon your meditation. It's built upon your meditation. And yet the stability of your meditation is built on your ethics and your morality. If you have a shaky ethical life, you're going to have a shaky meditation, and you will not see the nature of mind and reality. And we tend to forget this. We tend to hopscotch over the grittiness of working with these infrastructure levels. And in exactly the same way, how many yoga practitioners can name all 8 limbs of Ashtanga yoga? We tend to forget that asanas, the poses, which are virtually synonymous with our understanding of yoga, that's just one limb. What about the other 7? So single action bias is really, it's the inappropriate weight distribution. We're putting all our weight onto one limb, while the other 7 tend to atrophy. And eventually that one limb will bend, buckle, and break. And mixing my metaphors here, the one that I really like is, if you think that meditation alone, for instance, or asana alone can transform you, it's a little bit like riding a unicycle on an icy road full of potholes and debris. Sooner or later, I mean, you can have the image of a unicycler in a circus, always self-correcting, always teetering, tottering. Sooner or later, you're going to fall over. So what's very helpful is to distribute the weight properly. Imagine switching out a unicycle with a military-type 8-wheel drive vehicle, an ATV that has tremendous traction, that distributes the weight properly. So in my experiences, people often come to me as a meditation instructor and they're stuck on the path. Almost always it's because they're spinning their solitary wheel. So I like to say sometimes humorously that unfortunately, failure on the path is a weight problem. It's a weight distribution problem. It's an inappropriate allocation of all your resources into one method, and then a disregard to the others. So imagine what would happen if you had traction with all 8 aspects of the Eightfold Noble Path. Look at the type of traction you can develop if you have this kind of power. I was at another program a couple of weeks ago where a friend of mine, who's been a very serious practitioner of Vajrayana Buddhism for decades, she came to me with the latest iteration of a problem she's been working with for over a dozen years. And she meditates like crazy, and yet she's not able to get at and transform this one root problem. And I kept really thinking to her, if you only could realize that there are other methods of transformation at your disposal, get off your solitary wheel, or at least distribute the weight properly, and perhaps you will then gain the traction to move forward. So when Ken these days is talking so elegantly about a 4th turning or steps towards a possible 4th turning, I think it's just as compelling to talk about a possible 4th yana or 4th vehicle. And this is another way to talk about the overarching classification of Buddhist doctrine altogether. This classification refers to the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana, yana meaning vehicle. The Hinayana being the narrow vehicle, working primarily with oneself. Mahayana being the great vehicle, raising your gaze and working with others. And the Vajrayana, of course, being the all-encompassing vehicle. But it's very, I think, appropriate to talk about a 4th vehicle, an ATV, so to speak, an all-terrain vehicle, which to me is very confluent with Akwal. Akwal really is a kind of ATV, an all-terrain vehicle that not only distributes the weight properly from a phenomenological or interior transformative perspective, but allows you to distribute and allocate your resources and your weight across all domains of human experience. Think about what kind of transformative prowess you have if you put all gears, all 8 wheels, or whatever metaphor you want to use, into proper traction. This is something that not only can move you forward, but as Ken is trying to really profess now, it can move the entire tradition of Buddhism forward. This is real traction. This is the way to get going. And in this regard, I find integral theory highly resonant with Vajrayana Buddhism altogether. And by this, what I mean is that a synonym for the Vajrayana is upaya-yana. Upaya means skillful means. So the Vajrayana is the vehicle of skillful means. And by that, what it means, What it refers to is that you can use, in fact, the invitation is to do this, every aspect of your life as a transformative tool. This becomes the quick path because everything becomes the path. Nothing is left out. So I see integral theory and integral life practice very much resonant with Upayayana. It really speaks to me in this regard. And I think we only need to raise our gaze and look around us. The intimations of this kind of integrated fourth turning approach that are already hinted at in the Western world. So for instance, earlier I referred to Shambhala Buddhism, which is one of the traditions that I follow. Trungpa Rinpoche, who was the founder of Shambhala, and Shambhala Buddhism truly, he saw that in this day and age, we need to work with enlightened society. Shambhala Buddhism is really all about enlightened society, working with the lower right, if you understand the quadrants. And closely resonant with that, of course, is working with the cultural forms of that society. So Shambhala Buddhism engages all three. It engages the upper left, and lower right. Really gaining traction, really paying attention to what needs to be done in the Western world to bring about transformation in this day and age, what's relevant here and now. And I also find it very interesting that the upper right, the only quadrant that may be left out with Shambhala Buddhism, this is what things like mind and life is working with. This extraordinary set of dialogues that began some 25 years ago with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and some of the world's greatest scientists. Bridging the world of the interior with the exterior. And a number of years ago, His Holiness said, let's go even further. Let's take the insights of mind and life that we've been talking about and let's bring them into schools. Let's bring them into culture. Let's bring them into the world. So His Holiness is very savvy. He's completely aware of what is going to be needed to transplant this ancient noble tradition into a Western vocabulary, into a Western form. And he's doing so by bridging the world of science and Buddhism. And then now saying, let's take these insights and let's spread them across culture and society altogether. It's terribly exciting what these groundbreaking pioneers are really bring forth. So I want to close my time with you by sharing, I believe, a really compelling, provocative quote that comes from His Holiness the 17th Karmapa. The 17th Karmapa is the head of the principal lineage of Tibetan Buddhism that I follow, which is the Karma-Kagyu tradition. He's a young, brilliant teacher who has been to the West a number of times and is really starting to see, very sensitive social student, what really needs to be done. And he puts forth this almost testament that I believe every practitioner and especially teacher of Buddhism in the West needs to be aware of. So this is His Holiness speaking. Since the benefit of beings is the foremost goal, there is no absolute necessity that everything we say in our teachings be in line with Buddhist philosophical doctrines. This is so because it is possible for some students not to receive much benefit from presentations given strictly on the basis of traditional Buddhist philosophies and ideas. One must use all the means at one's disposal, be they Buddhist or non-Buddhist, to benefit others. This means that for bodhisattvas, there are a lot of things to learn. There is nothing that does not become an area of study for a bodhisattva. The reason why we have to study in so many areas is because we have to cater to the various needs, interests, and abilities of many different people. For this reason, bodhisattvas must not have only a good heart. They must also possess vast intelligence. Whatever major or minor methods for accomplishing happiness there are in the world, we must have respect for all of them. Not only must we respect them, we must learn and engage in those methods when appropriate. Whether they are from the Dharma or from the mundane world, we must pay attention to and study all skillful methods available. We might think that some methods, since they do not fit snugly with Buddhist philosophies, are useless and to be abandoned. However, if we abandon them, we will only be doing so because those methods do not seem suitable for us, not because of our concern for others. This is unacceptable. Therefore, we must remember that it is important to be as inclusive as a teacher as possible. Being capable of thinking in this way is an indispensable quality for a bodhisattva. So I just want to close in saying that in my 30-year study of Ken's work and in my developing friendship with him, I have really come to see him as one of these bodhisattvas. His incredible capability to survey the entire spectrum of world discipline and wisdom tradition and scientific tradition, and to really act as almost a kind of intellectual William the Conqueror who can really bring together all these sometimes warring factions of intellectual and spiritual tradition into one unified voice, a kind of a chorus of sanity, is really a marvelous, marvelous contribution of a true bodhisattva, very much in the spirit of what His Holiness here is putting forth. So it is my great honor and privilege in whatever way I can to support this majestic project and to really join the wisdom of the East with the wisdom of the West, bring these incredible traditions together to help us wake up, grow up, and then really fundamentally show up. How can we take this incredible wisdom tradition that is being unified in such an elegant way and show up and shine into the world and bring the shine to help others wake up? So it's really been a delight for me to spend a little bit of time with you. Thank you for listening to my words. And I wish you all the very best on your path and an open invitation to simply see if these truths, the truths put forth by integral theory, the truths put forth by this Buddhist tradition, speak to you and can be used in your own personal growth and transformation.